security. And Bloomberg did an investigation. Anyway, they they made it through the security checks until they were actually going to be handling some really super high security data, and they Hello, my name is Lisa Morganelli. I'm with Issues in Science and Technology, which is a quarterly journal that is a partnership between the National Academy of Sciences and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues, but it's a little bit different than our normal thing because it is a collaboration with ASU's Center for Science and the Imagination. We have a partnership with them around future tense fiction. Future tense fiction is a speculative fiction series that uses imagination to explore how science and technology will shape our future. Issues regularly publishes Future Tense's short original stories, artwork, and expert response essays. And recently we did a podcast miniseries. And the goal is to connect the fictional narratives to real world policy debates. Now, today we're taking a slightly different tack because science fiction and speculative fiction often kind of revolve around technology and the so-called hard sciences. But today we are doing something different by exploring the relationship between speculative fiction and the social sciences. And I am really happy to introduce today's discussion. What is fiction's role in imagining better social policies? Before I introduce the speakers and the moderator, I just want to say that about half of this discussion will be a moderated discussion amongst the moderator and the panelists. And the other half of the discussion will be taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, put your questions in the Q&A function, which is at the very bottom of your screen. And then those will go to the moderator, who will ask the panelists your questions in the second half. Also, we have the chat space open for you. Please feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat. We do archive the chat afterwards and make that available after some light editing. So let's get started. Our moderator today is Ed Finn, who is the founding director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. He is here from Arizona. First panelist is Karen Lord, who is I'm going to have to get this word correct because there's a lot of it. Karen Lord, who is a speculative fiction writer, and she is beaming in from Barbados today. Annalee Newitz is a science journalist and a speculative fiction author. She's coming in from San Francisco. Malka Older is a sociologist. She's also the executive director of Global Voices, and she's a speculative fiction writer. She is coming in from the continent today. And Craig Calhoun, university professor of social sciences, Arizona State University, and a speculative fiction reader. He's coming in from New York. So thank you very much. Welcome to this, and I'm looking forward to talking with you and listening to this. Take it away, Ed.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that great introduction. It's so great to see you all here. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be talking with this amazing group of folks. I want to jump right in with the first question, getting to the heart of the topic of the panel. This notion that speculative fiction, and especially science fiction, is really about new technologies. A lot of people associate great science fiction stories with that amazing new gizmo or the rocket ship or something like that. And so I want to open by asking what you all think of that proposition. Is the work of science fiction to help us come up with these new technological nova, new words, new descriptors to imagine things that we could design in the future? Or is it about social and cultural change? What is the work that science fiction and speculative fiction can do in the context of social science? And is that something that's changing over time, or has it been a through line throughout the history of the genre? What do you guys think?
I mean, I'm gonna say ¿por qué no los dos? Because also I don't want to yuck anyone's yum. And if you're super into discussions of orbital mechanics, yes, I'm looking at Seven Eves, then that's great. And I, enjoyed those in moderation too. But I do think that a big part of the reason that science fiction comes with a story and characters is that we're not just interested in the technology itself and the specifications of it or even how they make it work. We're interested in what it does to us as a society. So for me, when I'm reading science fiction, like, yes, I can read about some cool tech and be like, ooh, that sounds really cool. But the part that will make me stick with the book and reread the book is the implications of how that affects the characters, how they deal with it. And, you know, it's not just a one-way thing either. It's if they're going to appropriate the technology and use it for something other than what it was intended for. I don't remember which William Gibson book it was, because as we discussed previously in the green room, we can never remember the book titles that we want when we want them. But there's one of the books where he's got this, you know, the amazing dragon convenience store and some of the technology they have for sending things, in the way that the kids who live on the bridge are using it for something else. And that's so important. And just the way that these technologies have second and third order impacts that are not directly related to their immediate purpose, and what that does to society. And for me, that's the fascinating part of reading science fiction and writing it.
I just want to springboard off something Malka said. When you said, why not both? I was immediately thinking that. But I would also argue that another fascinating thing for me is seeing how science and technology also evolves out of what kind of society we are to start with. So it's a kind of a push and pull situation. I've read some fascinating science fiction stories that portray alien scientists or scientists in a parallel universe or what are or alternate history, where the philosophy, the approach, the kind of the whole point of science changes very subtly from what we know of it right now, and also the technologies that come out of that, again, also are going to look different, are going to be used differently, and are possibly also going to have different effects on the society. So it's very much a lot of moving parts, and they're all connected.
Yeah, and
Let
if
me
we
just throw
look,
out the additional idea that lots of technologies are pretty inherently social. And so the idea that on the one hand you have technology, on the other hand you have society, and then there are causal arrows going back and forth is misleading. We can think of media technologies, AI today as examples, but in other ways too, technologies are pretty significantly social, and therefore the science fiction and speculative fiction treatments of them get caught up with that. And a related theme is the extent to which we look at these from different vantage points. Some of the fascination of, for example, of looking at the three-body problem with Liu Cixin in recent years is looking at some questions that turn on his perspective from China and how that informs the technology-society relationship.
yeah, and if you look back at the history of science fiction and the way sort of we frame it, some of the earliest works like RUR, about a robot uprising, or Frankenstein, which is about, you know, a person who has been invented by a white dude who kind of just wants him to be an obedient little guy. And of course he isn't. You know, built into these stories of technology is always a kind of social relationship of power. And I always think it's hilarious when science fiction fans, who of course all of us encounter at conventions and meetings and things, will say, you know, oh, but in the golden age of science fiction, you know, when Asimov was writing, science fiction wasn't political, it wasn't social, it's just about the technology. But if you actually go back and read I, Robot, I mean, the Will Smith movie, whatever, but the original story, the main character is a robo-psychologist. The frame story is that she is putting robots into therapy because the orders they've been given, the 3 laws of robotics, which require robots to obey Homo sapiens, they are driving the robots insane. And that's built into this story of technology, that there is something psychologically damaging about having a person being owned by a corporation, or about having social relationships that create massive inequality. And so that's always been a preoccupation of the genre, but we like to, at various points in history, I think that critical communities, fan communities like to kind of pretend that that's not going on. And you know, luckily right now, I think we're in a period where people are very happy to see that going on, and the subtext is we're allowed to talk about that subtext much more openly.
So I think one thing that I've heard throughout all of your responses is the role that speculative fiction can play in articulating alternative social structures and social models, and also the powerful role of individual characters, that we really need to feel the future through these people and looking over their shoulders or stepping in their shoes for a little while. So what happens when you start to do that intentionally? Annalee, in the intro to We Will Rise Again, you talk about the need for speculative fiction stories that take social science seriously. So it's really an intentional effort to maybe construct or shape these dialogues or invite people into particular kinds of futures. And of course, that resonates with us at the Center for Science and the Imagination, because we're really trying to use science fiction as a tool to invite people into thinking about hopeful futures. So what does that actually look like? What does it look like for speculative fiction to take social science seriously?
Well, one of the things that that Karen and Malka and I were thinking about when we were putting together the anthology "We Will Rise Again" was how historically speculative fiction authors have been in dialogue with scientists often, or you know, they've been in dialogue with engineers, or they've actually been scientists or engineers. And so we asked all of the writers who contributed to talk to a community leader, a political activist, an organizer who has worked in, you know, community resistance. And we were like, talk to them and find out what's real, like what's realistic, like what could you actually imagine happening, instead of the kind of Wizard of Oz idea where, you know, you defeat the witch and everybody dances and you're fine forever, democracy is saved and nothing ever happens again. So that's, I think, one way that you do it is by actually fostering dialogues between people who are imagining and people who have real world experience with how humans actually behave.
Yeah, I think that's so important. One of the things I think about a lot is something I call narrative disorder, which is the way that we're affected by the narratives that we consume, especially if there's kind of a tendency to certain plots or certain depictions of how certain people act, that can really have an impact on the way people think and experience the world. And as a you know, as my sociology, my focus is mainly disaster studies. And so this makes a really good example for me, because in disaster movies, there's almost always a crowd panic scene. And in disaster studies, this is one of the like oldest, most studied and reinforced truisms, is that that doesn't happen. The masses don't panic. And so to see this stark contrast between what the studies show, and I've worked in disaster response as well, and I've also seen situations where I fully expected people to panic because I had also been affected by watching these movies over and over again, and that was not what happened. People waited quietly in line for hours and hours to get what they needed. And it's not to say there are never riots, it's not to say people never scream and run, but it's usually for a rational reason, or because of very long drawn out impacts with no response, which is also a rational response to that. So seeing that contrast of like, oh, these movies are telling us over and over again that this is something we should expect and that will happen, and the studies and the personal experience are saying exactly the opposite, has really made me think that we need to be doing this. We need to be taking social science seriously. We need to be building on our experiences rather than building on this house of cards edifice of tropes that have been just repeated over and over again.
Malka, you're mentioning movies in a way which is interesting,
Right.
because we face with movies a 2-hour time frame. The action's got to happen, a need for a protagonist character, resolution with that frame and all that. So even compared to science fiction or speculative fiction novels, this can be a edited down, streamlined, condensed, and reductionistic account. And then some of the issues about the relationship of speculative fiction and films to social science have the same thing. So if we're looking at disasters that unfold over a period of months or years, this is a challenge for keeping the narrative going. And we get the kind of distortion you're talking about. But we get them even more, I think, from films.
Yeah, I said films for a reason. And I'll just say before I see Karen, you're next, and I don't want to take too much time, but that also has a real impact, because what we see in disaster response is that people, excuse me, people are much more likely to give when there's a rapid impact disaster, and particularly when it's photogenic in its way, and when it's something that they can imagine happening to themselves. So the fact that we don't tell enough stories about slow onset disasters, which can also be very dramatic in a suspense way, or if it's done right, it has a real impact on the world and the way that people interpret disasters and their responsibilities towards them.
Malka and Craig said something that was, to me, is very important. That's the whole question of how we view time, as in terms of time in real life and time in narratives on screen or in text. The arc of a society and the arc of a character are just two completely different scales. In one sense, I have to say that I'm really an admirer of the Foundation series, because this is Asimov again, but we're saying good things about Asimov, because this is actually looking at a kind of a societal change over a long stretch of time. And for some people, the books are actually a challenge to read because we don't stick with any one character. There are interesting ways in which the adaptation that's being done on screen right now is trying to almost like, gerrymander that. And I know they got to keep actors on for a certain amount of time for their contracts and so on. But there's this way in which they're trying to make this continuity happen. But the reality is that huge social change is a generational project, it's a generational experience. And there are ways in which we can't shrink it down. There are ways in which we can't minimize it and make it into a simple story. So I think we do have to broaden our expectations of what a story about a society can be, and not be too attached to your single protagonist and your single victories.
This is a really interesting thread because it brings up something that I personally find fascinating, the persistence of certain stories. Malka, you mentioned already this popular notion that after disaster, there's going to be chaos and looting, and people are going to panic. Which isn't borne out by reality. And in fact, people respond in much more pro-social ways, as you said. But there are a lot of these stories that are incredibly persistent and shape our organization, our conception of society. And I don't know if those are if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or maybe that's not the right question to ask. But I wanted to ask the question about how you start to change those persistent narratives and when you get to do that. Annalee mentioned Frankenstein, which is one of my favorite books, and I think a rare example of a story that introduced a new sort of permanent narrative into our collective consciousness. And now you don't even need the whole word. You can just put Franken in front of another word, and we already know what we're talking about. That's how deep it's gotten into our collective psyche. So I wanted to bring this back to you, Craig, because so much of your research focuses on large-scale transformation, large-scale societal change, whether that's in institutions, communities, political, economic, social systems. So what role does storytelling play in that change? What narratives are helpful? Is it possible to intentionally change those collective stories that shape our experience of what is possible and what the social construct even is?
Well, there's the policymaker's dream. You can mobilize the fiction to reinforce what you want the public to think so that your policies will be successful. But lots of the excitement of speculative fiction of various kinds comes from imagining possible futures the policymaker didn't. Not just possible policies, but the unintended consequences of policies, the ways in which different storylines intersect. So the policymaker was making economic policy or was making health policy, but in fact, we've got these various stories intersecting in different ways. And that's true of fiction in general. I mean, this is what Dostoevsky's up to. It's not just, if you will, science fiction, but I think it's important. The extent to which a variety of kind of changes in what the world is like are necessarily or almost necessarily backgrounded by policymakers, right? So yes, there's some gigantic geopolitical change, or less, yes, there's a fundamental shift in the way people live. Just to take an example, something like the proportion of people who live alone in contemporary society, which then affects the way a variety of policies work and all that, but affects people's lives and some of these trends are noticed earlier by fiction writers than they are even by social scientists, but fiction writers and social scientists both are putting on the agenda. So take the way gender came on the agenda. A different aspect of the Mary Shelley story, not what she says about Frankenstein, doctor or creature, but who she is, right? And the importance of this author who is changing the way people will think about authorship at the same time, who has these famous parents who are also figures, and how do they come into the story and all that. So I won't belabor the point, but I think the extent to which change exceeds anything predictable. And the biggest service to policymaking is to enlarge the imagination of what's going on and could go on, that into which policymaking is one sort of intervention. And here I'd say policymaking's like technology. People who are engaged in developing technologies are constantly amazed and frustrated by the fact that they're not used for what they intended them for. Either they're not used at all, or they're used for something else, or something else is made of them. The design world, the engineering worlds try to take this into account by working with social scientists. Well, hey, if we introduce this technology, will you go study some early users so we can see what people actually do with it? And can we feed that back into our design? And in a way, fiction's been doing this all along. So I think it's really important.
I would just like to add something about the question about how do we mobilize stories in the service of social change and policy change. And I think we rightly should have anxiety around that because, of course, propaganda and psyops and a lot of kind of nefarious uses of stories by governments and militaries are really dangerous. And we don't necessarily want to arm we don't want to weaponize stories and we don't want to use them to lie to people or get them to vote against their interests or murder their neighbors, right? So I think that sorry, I have a cat who's yelling at me in the background. She has her own narrative about this situation, which is not anything to do with us on Zoom. And so I think that for me as a fiction writer, but also as a journalist who's observed social change and has written a lot about psyops, I think that the best kinds of stories for social change are kind of open world stories where many people can participate in them. And so like maybe the ideal model would be something like fandom of a story. And I think that's why things like Frankenstein are so appealing, because Frankenstein is everywhere. Like that's everyone's story now. I was just thinking about Godzilla because we're having a Godzilla festival here in San Francisco this weekend. It's 70 years of Godzilla. It's actually 71, but whatever. And Godzilla is also like Frankenstein. Godzilla has come to stand in for systemic problems like warfare or climate change. And we all talk about Godzilla. There's many kaiju stories. We're able to, as regular people or as film studios or whatever, take up that story and tell something new. And I think that's really important, the idea that the story remains alive and that we can revise it and that we can use it in our own new narratives, which is one of the reasons why the struggle over who owns a story, like IP struggles, like with Disney wanting to clamp down on who's able to tell stories about Mickey Mouse and stuff like that, why that's actually part of a system of kind of narrative oppression, right? Like we're not allowed to tell stories about these characters that we all think about all the time. So that's why it's, delightful when, say, Winnie the Pooh is released into the public domain and we can start telling weird stories about Winnie the Pooh.
Can I throw out one thing in the same vein quickly, which is just one welcome version of speculative fiction is rewriting history. So it's not just speculations about the future. And something like, I don't know, Neil Stephenson's Baroque trilogy or something, trying to look again at a fairly well-known history using some real characters, some fiction characters, events that happened and events that didn't happen exactly that way, and events that might have happened that way, but we don't know, to open up, exactly as Annalie's saying, our thinking about necessity in history, which is in much need of opening up, because if we think history is really necessary and fixed, we then tend to think that the present is necessary and fixed, and the next steps are necessary and fixed when they're not.
Imaginative skills and tools and practices that could help us create better social policy. And obviously, I think that this conversation about speculative fiction could be a part of that, that maybe we need to be more generative. And this is something that Craig and a few of you have said, that that good stories and well-crafted worlds allow us to find not just the automobile, but the traffic jam, right? That's an Isaac Asimov, that's a quote's attributed to him, among others. So should we be bringing more speculative fiction into policy? And what are the other ways in which we can create more imaginative and richer understandings or conversations about the future?
Well, I think a lot about the way that we imagine the future, and particularly the different ways that we value different types of imagining the future. And our society at the moment is very fixated on quantitative and particularly impersonal ideas of what makes something rigorous. So if you look at the predictions of the future that are considered nonfiction, they're often in passive voice, or they attribute agency more to some large amorphous concept like the economy. If they talk about people, they don't talk about individuals, they talk about groups. And this reflects an idea that we can, if we have the quantitative power, calculate what's going to happen in some way that makes sense. And that all we need is like numbers and math and investment. And I think that there's really a huge risk here in terms of what we're missing by not thinking about people as individuals who have agency, by not thinking also about groups of people who have relationships and care about each other in different ways, positive and negative. And so, and this is borne out really if we look at history and the way we talk about history, so much of history comes back to like one guy being really petty and annoyed at someone else, or, whether one marriage had a child or not, or what they did after that. And, all of these things that are not calculatable, that have such a huge impact on the way the world unfolds. So I think looking at policy, for me, we have to really come back to thinking about the individual humans involved and stop hand waving away the fact that the policy affects individuals, families, and their lives, and stop reducing everything to a dollar number and saying, oh, this is how much it will cost if we displace these people, and think about actual human impact. For me, that's really important going forward.
I would like to add a little bit to that. I feel that sometimes, even when we want to use speculative fiction as a sort of a thought experiment lab for things, we have to understand that it still needs to be grounded. And being grounded means that you need to have respect for the things you don't know or don't even realize that you don't know. So there are not only different fields of inquiry, scientific inquiry or social inquiry that you're not well versed in, there are also different philosophies, there are different worldviews, there are different cultures, and all of these things have an impact. So I think that you have to, what the speculative fiction field does for me is that it challenges people to expand what they think of as, this is how we approach the world. So it's more of a mindset adjustment. But the groundedness of actually doing the research of the different fields and the different points of view and respecting the expertise that may be found there, that cannot be overlooked.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about Angela Saini has this great book called The Patriarchs, which is a grand history of patriarchy. And one of the things that she found in her historical research was that, we have this longstanding myth that patriarchy as a social structure comes out of the family, and that it's just this natural thing that there's patriarchy in the family, and then the state becomes patriarchal. And she was like, actually, it turns out, if we look at history, it isn't that way. It's the other way around, that you get a patriarchal state that imposes that on family life. And families get changed by the law and by social custom that comes from, centralized power. And so that's, again, like this really important part of storytelling is when you tell the stories of people's intimate lives in their families or in their friendships, that gives you a vantage point to look at how a whole civilization works. And also that's, people are the smallest unit of resistance to that as well. Like if you want to change society, sometimes you just have to change the way people form families, or you change the way people make friends, and that can eventually change the government.
But conversely, then you also get big social trends, say population growth, and that have consequences for individuals, that change individuals' lives, that individuals deal with in various sorts of ways. So one of the things that fiction does is make connections between these bigger trends and individuals as they attempt to author their lives. But it's not always that individuals are the causal agents as such, that somebody said something, let's have a population explosion. But that a statistically aggregatable range of individuals make decisions in their lives that result in this, and then they resist, they trend, there are consequences. There's all of that. And it either gets on the agenda or it doesn't. So it takes a long time to be noticed. It's misunderstood for a long period of time. And that then gives rise to certain sorts of fiction that shift what's being seen in the world, what's being noticed about this.
One of the interesting threads here is that there's a certain responsibility involved in storytelling. I think Karen was alluding to that, and this question of the figuring of an individual as a representative of a zeitgeist or representative of a larger social change is something that you see in a certain mode of storytelling, and that I forget, we talked about Russian novels before, right? And that's the sort of thing you see in some of those classics, or in the work of somebody like Kim Stanley Robinson, who's very much thinking about big history in the future, future history, but also having that embodied through different characters. So I want to open this up to some of the wonderful questions we have from our audience, and this first one is maybe a connection in terms of this notion of responsibility in storytelling. So this is from Zachary, who writes to say that he worries that the use of science fiction to inform policy is still a very niche activity, even if it's beloved by those of us here in this conversation. So what would it take for science fiction to really inform policy and national dialogue? What's the stretch goal that people on this call should push for? Which is a great question. What would be the victory condition or a really successful articulation of this? That last bit was me. Zachary didn't have that.
Hey, Zach, great to see you. Also, I'm going to actually question the premises of this question a little bit, because I think that it is very hard now for people to say that they are basing their policy proposal on science fiction. In fact, we see science fiction get used all the time as a kind of insult to policy proposals. Not always saying that something is evil, quite often just saying something's unrealistic. Should probably go the other way. But at the same time, we do see a lot of stuff that is influenced by science fiction, sometimes in the subtler ways. We're seeing more and more talk about how science fiction has influenced tech, particularly people who got very rich on tech, and how those people then influence policy. I'm going to tell a story that still infuriates me, so I will try to keep it myself calm through this. But I was at the World Press Freedom Day event run by the UN some months ago, and they had this big, conference with lots of panels, and then they had this sort of session where the announcer person started talking about how science fiction influences tech and how exciting it is. And I was kind of like, I was sitting in the room like, oh, interesting, science fiction, neat, tech, cool. And she said she brought out an AI generated bot of Aldous Huxley to talk about Brave New World. And it was so disturbing because it was kind of paying lip service to the idea of science fiction as cutting edge and exciting and influencing things, while at the same time using this, first of all, a dead white man who's been dead for a long time, and also, a bot of someone who did not put a whole lot of text on the internet. I mean, even if you think that a bot could capture someone's personality, this is not the best use case, and said incredibly bland things about like, if I were to write Brave New World today, I would probably call it Brave New World Revisited. And literally, this is so. I think that there's a level of getting past the idea of what science fiction is, and that we would like policymakers to engage with all sorts of intellectual thinking, from science fiction to everything else, at a somewhat deeper level, that once again, I think needs to connect to human beings and the impact on human beings. So I would love for there not to be a stigma about stories and narratives affecting policy. But I would also love for us to collectively as a society, not just policymakers, like engage with science fiction conceptually in a different way.
Can part of that, Malka, be engaging with the differences and the different waves of science fiction and speculative fiction, right? So, Ed introduced this reflecting on the kind of science fiction often read by teenage boys, and which has a through line to certain kinds of technology-centered discussions about rocket ships and things like that. But a lot of recent excitement in science fiction has been women writing science fiction, women reading science fiction, and thematic shifts that came with this. And Ursula Le Guin was mentioned earlier, but there's a lot of this, and shifts about the way in which bodies are imagined and thought and all of this. Back to Mary Shelley, forward to Ursula Le Guin. But let me just also say, is it so clear that it doesn't influence policy? What about communities of science fiction, if you want to call it that, speculative fiction writing, that don't seem like they are us? What about the Left Behind books, which are surely some of the best-selling and most influential speculative fiction of recent years, situated very largely in evangelical Christian authorship and readership, and shaping narratives, including narratives with policy implications like pro-natalist policy, as being articulated by the vice president or others. So, should we, how do we find a way to enlarge the sense of who we, the speculative fiction authors and readers, are, to include this wider range of contributions?
Can I say that, we need to not be too prescriptive in our boundaries and definitions and lines here? While I was listening to you talking about these different waves and so on, as I said, I'm in Barbados, and we have a really quite different view of how speculative fiction and fantasy and myth and folklore incorporated into Caribbean literature. And we also may have a different kind of generational approach to it as well. I mean, when you talk about the Left Behind series, which I read a few of before I kind of had to fall off from that, I really can't, I don't know if it makes a difference to call it speculative fiction or not. It's not new as a genre. There is a genre of religious literature that engages with what the apocalypse is going to look like. And I don't think we can just immediately call it speculative fiction and then put it next to like Le Guin and all the rest of it. So, sometimes I think that boundaries can be helpful, but sometimes if we're trying too hard to see exactly where the definitions are, it then begins to be a question of what's your worldview? What are you looking at? What is it supposed to engage with? And ultimately, I do feel that what Malka is saying is that we do need to have intellectual engagement at all levels. We need to have better interpretation of even some of the classic texts. We do so entirely the wrong messages. Some of those.
Karen, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
There's a way in which we all have to level aspects of literature.
Karen, I'm sorry,
Can you hear me now?
connection. Yeah, it's
Yes?
a little. We lost the last maybe 30 seconds of what you were saying. It does seem a little better now. Maybe would you like to quickly restate the last thing you said?
No, I just said we all need to engage better with some of the literature we already have that is classic. So I think, and that's not just speculative fiction, but quite a lot of other literature as well. That's about it. Yeah.
I think that's a great point, especially because all of those stories are like archaeological layers in our collective imagination of how we think about the future. They never really go away, so we do have to contend with all of the stories we've already told about the future as we tell new stories about the future. And we actually have a new book series, Imagination Annotated, we're going to launch next summer with MIT Press that does just that. We're starting with a new annotated edition of a Jules Verne novel. I'm very excited about that series. But let me turn to another question. We have so many great ones. This is a bit of an extension of the last question. So when we treat speculative fiction as a laboratory of the mind for social policy, it's often a spectator sport. We read, discuss, or maybe write critical essays. So how might we move speculative fiction from being a consumable product to an active, practical tool? How do we put this into action? That's a question from Nick.
I mean, I think that's something that we really grappled with a lot in our anthology, We Will Rise Again, and thinking about how science fiction, speculative fiction can be galvanizing in the same way that a political speech could be. And I think to go back to some of what Malka and Karen were just saying, I mean, one of the things that science fiction can do for us is give us a realistic picture of what it's going to be like as an individual trying to affect social change or trying to engage in some kind of movement to do that, and what the knock-on effects are going to be. Because the best part about science fiction is it does offer you a portrait of another world. And fantasy does this too, of course. Like you get the world building, so you can kind of imagine what are all the little pieces that go into making up a different future. Like not just flying cars, but like who makes the rivets on the flying cars, right? What's the social system that allows you to have traffic control of flying cars? And at the same time, it also lets you think about the unintended consequences of kind of a new social policy. And so I think it's less about reading a story and then saying like, all right, I'm going to build the torment nexus that I read about in this story, right? It's not that. It's about the mindset of science fiction, thinking about technologies or policies alive in the world. And one of the things that I often say to policy students and policy writers who are interested in doing this is that one of the things that science fiction teaches you is that people always disobey. That's great. We want them to disobey a lot of the time, but sometimes we don't. And so we need to be thinking about, like, as we make this policy, it's not an automaton that's just following all the rules. And even if it were, they might need a robo-psychologist to help them deal with how hard that is. It's really like regular humans who are kind of trying to make their way into the future. And that was one of the things that I thought was really interesting when the Green New Deal was like actually potentially going to be part of our future, was that a lot of the politicians like AOC helped make a short science fiction video of what that future would look like. And I think that helps just to pave the way toward like, oh, well, how would we make a policy that would implement sustainable technology by creating jobs? Like, that's where the people fit into this story, is that they get jobs. It's not just that you suddenly get like a whole bunch of neat things to put in your pocket.
I'm also going to add to that I think, as important as that is of showing like the peace dividends, basically, like showing what it's like to be on the other side, I think there's also an even sort of lower bar way that science fiction can be really helpful. And, what I'm trying to do usually when I write science fiction, when I write like nearish future fiction, is not so much say, this is the world we should be going for, but look at all these things that you may not have realized are not inevitable. And I think, those are the hardest things often to fight against or change, because you don't even realize that they're an option. And for me, as personally, one of the ways that I was able to learn about this as I grew up as a young adult was by living in other countries. And I think that's, that's one way where you go like, oh, we always do things this way. Why do we always do things that way? Here they do things a different way and it works perfectly well. Like, it's different. You might like one more, the other more, but it's possible. And so, and I think science fiction is a way to do that by putting you in a different world and changing some of those underlying conditions that people never even question, and just opening that up, whether you're showing a specific different alternative that people can actually work for. That's why sometimes the technology doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter if we can't build that technology, because it's the social change under it, or the fact that it's unveiling something that we can change that's really important. And I also just want to say something again about our anthology, which is that there's another factor to it, which is one of the most powerful things for me working on this book, was the sense of that feeling like, oh, other people have gone through this too. And this, I think, is really important for policy, actually, because there's not that much new under the sun. And a lot of times people ignore all the other experiences, or we have this very, very powerful narrative in our society that leaders should be alone and out there on their own, just sucking it in and doing what they have to, and as their heroes. But actually, having a book like this where we can read about the kinds of resistance to oppression and the kinds of working towards collective action in a lot of different societies and contexts, and imaginary and non-imaginary, and just different ways, and just feeling, oh, someone has gone through something like this before and they've gotten through it, is just super powerful.
This is a nice bridge to another question from, I think it's Lisa, pointing out that our discussion has largely focused on speculative fiction and policy, but another important role for SF is to be a balm for people who are traumatized by our world, who have lost hope for the world we're living in right now. And Lisa writes that they haven't read the anthology, but as an exhausted activist had a really difficult year. I'm hoping to find comfort in these stories. So could the editor speak about whether this was one of the objectives of the book and the importance of speculative fiction at this moment in history?
Yes.
I do feel that we wanted to have that feeling of hope, that yes, it's a long, long race, it's a marathon, not a sprint, etc., etc. But here you can pause and just like take a breath and go, okay, you know what, this is worth it. And we were talking earlier, there's a spectrum. You will find stories of rage. You will find stories of pure fun. You will find stories that indeed show a really long slog of things. But then at the end, there will be just this one paragraph where you can go, ah, that was worth it. And I hope you'll find that in the one that I wrote of Tobias Buckell. It's actually a reprint called The Mighty Slinger, but it's literally a generational project. And at the end, we really wanted to have that sense of, we did it. It took generations to do it. It took centuries to do it. It didn't go in all the directions we hoped, but look, we've arrived. So yes, I really do think that that was one of our, our main goals, and we hope that it will do that for you.
Yeah, one of the things that is really, I think, popular right now in speculative fiction is being called cozy fiction. I think Malka's been accused of writing cozy fiction. I've been accused of doing it as well. And I think one of the things about cozy stories is that they often do take place against a backdrop of trauma and or systemic deprivation of some kind. And they kind of enact exactly what you're asking about, like that need for calmness and a balm, like in the midst of precarity. And so that is a big part of what we think about. And I mean, the story I have in this volume is specifically about somebody dealing with trauma and how they find a community that can help them. And I think that's a big part of activism that we often forget about, like, and I think it's great, like Adrienne Murray Brown, who talked to us for this volume, her work on pleasure activism has been really helpful in getting people to understand that you also have to have joy and ease and comfort and self-care as part of any kind of political action, because you have to model the community that you want to create. You can't just be like, oh, we're going to be a paramilitary organization with like strict hierarchy and beat up the people who are doing things wrong in order to have the revolution. We actually tried that, and it turned out those revolutions really sucked. So like now let's try a better model. And so we are hoping to model that model a little bit.
So let me jump in with one more question. This is from Andrea. Building on this book and movie connection, are there films the authors love that address these social issues in nuanced, thoughtful ways? Andrea is thinking about planning a sci-fi film series for design students to get them thinking about designing for the future in a fun, short format.
If you had said series instead of...
Go, Karen, go.
No, that was it. Every example I'm thinking of is a TV series and not a film, and that's why I'm just...
Yeah, I was actually going to go there too. I was about to say, every time we get a question about naming favorite things, it flies out of our heads, whether that's books or movies. I'm going to cheat and say that in my course about science fiction, I assign an episode from the new She-Ra series, which is, and this actually goes to, I know that Nick was saying he had some, or they had some different ideas about what they wanted the question to be about in terms of scenarios and role playing. It's actually a series where the She-Ra characters are kind of role playing out an attack that they're planning to do, and it shows the different characters imagining these in different ways, and has both sort of the positive and negative of playing things out in this way. Oh, you're making me blush, chat. And I think, I don't know, I can think of some other series that I've loved, like Orphan Black, but that the fun quotient of Orphan Black sort of depends on your tolerance for body horror. So I don't know.
I actually, just to pull something from very recent pop culture, I thought that the first half of the Wicked duology, I just saw the second half of Wicked for Good, which it's fine, but it's not really, you don't need that. But I think that the first one actually does a lot of the things that we're talking about here. It kind of defamiliarizes our world and gives us a chance to kind of peek under a lot of our assumptions about narrative, about people, and re-examine them. But it's also fun and comforting, and but it's a great example of how science fiction invites us to re-examine myths and narratives that we've inherited from the past, and kind of reinvigorates the original critique in Wizard of Oz, which was originally supposed to be a kind of liberal critical look at industrialism. So plus it's just such a great movie. So I think that's been on my mind a lot.
So let me jump in here and invite all of you to add one final comment. I guess the question here is, where do we go from here? How do we get better at this? How do we continue to build our capacity, our collective capacity to imagine more hopeful and inclusive futures? How do we build our momentum? And what are the next steps? That could be for you and your own pathways, and also for people who are in the audience here. What can we do?
I want to emphasize the importance of fun.
Because
when we're exhausted, when we are always focused on trying to pay bills, trying to eat, trying to live, etc., it really narrows down our band to the point where it's not possible to be imaginative, where it's really just a case of getting through the day. We need to normalize like leisure, spare time, fun, doing ridiculous for the sake of doing it, hobbies, all that kind of stuff. Things that we think of as trivial, things that will automatically decide when we think, oh, we got to focus on something more important. But this is where the subconscious gets to work. This is where you actually get the fuel for things you think of as important.
I'm gonna say, I think one of the most important lessons from speculative fiction that we have not mentioned yet is that nobody knows the future. Nobody knows what it's going to be like. We are being told constantly that certain developments are inevitable, that certain futures are going to happen. And in fact, the agency for changing the future, it may not be with one individual, but it's with individuals, it's with us. We can make the future we want. And we should not lose hope in the face of people trying to impose their fictions about the future on us. So consider imagining your own speculative futures as a form of resistance, and imagine wildly.
Yeah, I love both of those responses. And I would say I would extend that into the present, because I think one of the things about science fiction is that it defamiliarizes the present for us. It makes us see the world all around us with fresh eyes, and ask those questions that we've all been talking about today. Like, say, like, why do we do it that way? Do we have to do it that way? Does my body have to be like this? Like, maybe I could change it, or change the way people think of it. And so I think that muscle, the ability to do that, does come from reading. It comes from reading science, speculative fiction. It comes from reading books by people in other places, with other perspectives. And I don't mean in a kind of crude way, like you should read books by people who disagree with you. That's not it. What it is read books that offer you a brand new way of looking at the world, which isn't just about having a contradiction, having an argument with someone. It's about really immersing yourself in their perspective and having empathy. And so, yeah, I think reading as a practice, joyful reading, really does, it allows us to remember that the present doesn't have to be the way it is either. And in fact, it isn't really the way we think it is. The present is actually often quite different from how we suspect that it is.
Greg, do you want to add a very quick final response, or do we need to wrap up, Lisa?
Well, we do need to wrap up, but I note that Craig has not spoken.
Well, I'll speak if that's necessary. I'm not sure it's necessary, but very much like all three of Karen's and Annalie's responses to that last question, and I just want to build on Annalie's by saying, and think about where authors are coming from. So it's the authorial perspective of how can we write a more hopeful future? How can we head this direction is complemented by the reader's perspective of how do I understand where different people are coming from who offer different imaginations of the present and the future, which I think is really important to contemplate.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand this over to Lisa after I tell you we have one more Future Tense event next week on December 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern to talk about our new Climate Imagination book. So if you would like more, please come to that. We'd love to see you. Thank you so much to our panelists. And now over to you, Lisa.
Hello. Thank you very much, Ed, Karen, Annalee, Malka, Craig, that was a really wonderful conversation. I really hope that issues can be a cozy place to consider both the sort of technocratic policymaking that happens, but also what it means to have fun and leisure and how to imagine another world. And that's creating cozy spaces is, I think, actually quite an aspiration at this moment. So it was really a delight to have you in the audience here. I love the idea that Frankenstein and Godzilla belong to everyone, by the way. And I just want to say that Malka was involved with Future Tense and Issues in making a 5-episode miniseries called Not Now But Soon. And that also belongs to everyone. It's totally free. And there is the book We Can Rise Again. If you like this conversation, sign up for our newsletter on issues.org. And we'll be back next year. We have tons of events. And if you get our newsletter, you will find out about all of those events. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to CSI. Thank you to the book. Have a lovely rest of your day.